Hello, my dear friends. You are standing in absolute darkness. The air around you is thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of fired clay and ancient river mud. Your bare feet press against bricks so precisely cut that not even a blade of grass could slip between them. You hear water, not the rushing chaos of a wild river, but something controlled, something engineered. Somewhere in this darkness, water flows through channels that were designed 4,000 years before you were born. You reach out your hand and touch a wall. The bricks are still warm from the sun that set hours ago. They are smooth, almost polished by centuries of human hands brushing against them. You are in Mohenjo Daro. You are standing in a city that was ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were still new. This is the Indus Valley. This is the place that rewrites everything you thought you knew about early human civilization. Now imagine the sounds returning. The soft murmur of voices speaking a language that no living person has ever deciphered. The gentle splash of water being poured into ceramic vessels. The distant lowing of cattle being led through perfectly straight streets. This was not a primitive settlement of scattered huts and crude survival. This was a metropolis. This was urban planning that would not be matched again for thousands of years. And yet, we do not know their kings. We do not know their gods. We cannot read a single word they wrote. Here is what most people believe about ancient civilization. They believe it began in Mesopotamia. They believe the Sumerians invented cities, invented writing, invented everything that makes us human. They believe progress moved in a straight line from primitive to advanced. But the Indus Valley shatters this comfortable story. These people built sophisticated drainage systems while Europeans were still living in mud huts. They created standardized weights and measures across hundreds of miles of territory. They constructed multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing. And then they vanished, not in a blaze of conquest or catastrophe that we can clearly identify. They simply faded from the stage of history. Their cities crumbled, their language died, their secrets sank beneath the soil of modern Pakistan and India. For nearly 4,000 years, farmers planted crops above their buried streets without knowing what slept beneath their fields. So, before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we will drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The story of the Indus Valley Civilization is a story of mysteries wrapped in silence. It is a story of a people who achieved greatness and left us almost nothing to remember them by. No great monuments proclaiming the names of conquering kings. No temples covered in religious texts explaining their beliefs. No epic poems celebrating their heroes. Just brick. Endless, perfect, precisely measured brick, and the haunting shapes of seals carved with animals and symbols that mock our attempts at understanding. The Indus Valley Civilization flourished between roughly 3300 BCE and 1300 BCE. At its peak, it was the largest of all ancient civilizations. Larger than Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, it stretched across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and parts of Afghanistan. Nearly 5 million people may have lived within its boundaries. They built over 1,000 settlements that we have discovered so far. Perhaps many more still sleep beneath the earth, waiting for future archaeologists to disturb their rest. The two greatest cities were Mohenjo Daro and Harappa. These names were given by later peoples. We do not know what the original inhabitants called their homes. Mohenjo Daro may have meant something like Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language, but this is only a guess. The true name of the city died with the last person who spoke their forgotten tongue. Harappa was discovered first, in the 1820s, by British engineers building a railway line. They found an endless supply of ancient bricks, perfectly fired, perfectly shaped. They used these sacred relics to build railway tracks. Thousands of years of human achievement became foundation stones for colonial transportation. By the time archaeologists realized what had been destroyed, countless artifacts had been scattered or lost forever. This careless beginning set the tone for much of what followed. The Indus Valley Civilization would always be overshadowed by its more famous neighbors. Egypt had pyramids and golden masks. Mesopotamia had towering ziggurats and clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing. The Indus had bricks, beautiful, ordinary, heartbreaking bricks, and mysteries that grow deeper with every new discovery. Tonight, we will walk together through these vanished streets. We will seek to understand the people who left us riddles instead of answers. The geography of the Indus Valley shaped everything about this civilization. Two great rivers dominated the landscape. The Indus itself, flowing from the Himalayan mountains down to the Arabian Sea, and the Gagahakra, a river that no longer exists in its ancient form. These rivers were the lifeblood of the civilization. They provided water for drinking and bathing. They flooded the surrounding plains with nutrient-rich silt. They served as highways for trade and communication. But rivers are fickle gods. They shift their courses. They flood without warning. They can bring life one season and death the next. The Indus Valley people understood this intimately. They built their cities with a deep respect for water. They channeled it, stored it, worshipped it, and feared it. The annual flooding cycle determined everything. When the snows melted in the distant Himalayas, the rivers swelled. They overflowed their banks and spread across the floodplains. When the waters receded, they left behind black, fertile soil. This was the gift that made civilization possible. Farmers planted wheat and barley in this renewed earth. They harvested cotton, perhaps the first people in the world to do so. They grew peas and sesame and dates. They raised cattle, water buffalo, sheep and goats. This agricultural abundance freed some people from the daily struggle for food. It allowed specialists to emerge, craftsmen who made pottery and jewelry, merchants who organized trade across vast distances, engineers who designed the incredible infrastructure of the cities, and perhaps priests or rulers who directed the efforts of the entire society. But here is where the mystery begins to deepen. In Egypt, we know exactly who held power. The pharaohs left their names carved in stone across the land. They built tombs that proclaimed their glory for eternity. In Mesopotamia, kings recorded their conquests on clay tablets. They boasted of cities destroyed and enemies slain. In the Indus Valley, we find none of this. No palaces that clearly belonged to kings, no tombs filled with golden treasures, no inscriptions praising mighty rulers. If there were kings in Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, they left no record of themselves. Some scholars believe this suggests a different kind of society. Perhaps power was shared among councils of elders or merchants. Perhaps religious leaders guided the community without claiming royal authority. Perhaps the Indus people simply valued humility over self-promotion. We genuinely do not know. The archaeological evidence tells us only that someone organized this civilization. Someone decided that streets should run in straight lines. Someone established that bricks should be made in precise, standardized sizes. Someone decreed that every house should have access to water and drainage. But who this someone was remains forever hidden. The city of Mohenjo Daro covered over 250 hectares at its height. Perhaps 40,000 people lived within its walls. This made it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It was divided into two main sections. The western section sat on an artificial mound raised above the floodplain. This is often called the Citadel, but do not imagine a military fortress. There are no defensive walls bristling with weapons. There are no barracks for soldiers. Instead, the Citadel contained large public buildings. The most famous of these is the Great Bath. Imagine a rectangular pool, roughly 12 meters long and 7 meters wide. It was nearly 3 meters deep. The floor and walls were made of finely fitted bricks. They were sealed with a thick layer of natural bitumen to make them waterproof. This was sophisticated engineering. This was not a simple pond dug in the earth. This was a constructed vessel designed to hold water without leaking. Surrounding the pool were corridors and small rooms. Perhaps these were changing rooms for bathers. Perhaps they housed priests who oversaw purification rituals. The Great Bath suggests that water held deep religious significance. Bathing may have been a sacred act, not merely a practical one. This tradition continues today in the Hindu faith. The Ganges River is considered holy. Pilgrims travel from across India to bathe in its waters. Could this modern practice trace its roots back to Mohenjo Daro? It is a tantalizing possibility, but we cannot prove it. The people of the Indus left no religious texts. They left only silent stones and empty pools. Near the Great Bath stood another massive structure. Archaeologists call it the granary, but this name is also a guess. It was a large building raised on a brick platform. Channels underneath may have allowed air to circulate. This would have helped preserve stored grain by keeping it dry. Or perhaps it served an entirely different purpose. Perhaps it was a warehouse for trade goods. Perhaps it was a public hall for gatherings. The silence of the Indus people means every interpretation remains uncertain. Below the citadel stretched the lower city. This was where ordinary people lived and worked. The streets of the lower city were laid out in a careful grid pattern. Major thoroughfares ran north to south and east to west. They intersected at right angles, creating neat rectangular blocks. This was not the organic growth of a village gradually becoming a town. This was planned. Someone sat down before a single brick was laid and designed this city. They decided where every street would go. They calculated the width of major roads and minor lanes. They determined how the city would drain and where water would flow. This level of urban planning would not appear again in the Western world until the Greek and Roman eras, thousands of years later. The main streets were remarkably wide. Some measured nearly 10 meters across. This would have allowed carts to pass easily in both directions. It would have provided space for markets and crowds. It would have let light and air penetrate into the city center. Side streets and smaller lanes branched off from these main arteries. They led to residential areas where families lived in houses of various sizes. The smallest homes had only a single room or two. The largest were multi-story structures with dozens of rooms arranged around central courtyards. But here is something remarkable. Regardless of size, almost every house had access to water. Wells were common throughout the city. Over 700 wells had been identified in Mohenjo Daro alone. This is an astonishing number for an ancient settlement. It suggests that clean water was not a luxury reserved for the elite. It was a basic amenity available to most residents. And the water did not simply accumulate in stagnant pools. The Indus people created sophisticated drainage systems. Nearly every house had a bathing area. Usually this was a small brick-paved room with a sloping floor. Water would drain through a hole in the wall into a channel outside. These household drains connected to larger drains that ran beneath the streets. The street drains were covered with stone slabs or bricks. They could be lifted for cleaning and maintenance. This shows that the Indus people understood something fundamental about sanitation. Dirty water must be removed. It must flow away from where people live and work. If it accumulates, disease follows. This knowledge seems obvious to us today, but in the ancient world it was rare. Most cities of this era were filthy places. Waste accumulated in streets. Rivers became open sewers. Epidemics swept through populations regularly. The Indus Valley cities were different. Their drainage systems suggest a society that prioritized public health. This required central organization. Individual homeowners might keep their own houses clean, but maintaining a citywide drainage system required collective effort. Someone had to decide where the drains would run. Someone had to ensure they were built to consistent standards. Someone had to organize cleaning crews. This invisible administration is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Indus civilization. Not a single monument, but an entire system. A way of living together in dense populations without descending into squalor. The bricks themselves tell a story of standardization. In ancient Egypt, bricks varied widely in size. Different workers in different places made bricks according to their own preferences. But in the Indus Valley, bricks followed a specific ratio. They were made in proportions of approximately 1 to 2 to 4. The width, height, and length maintained this consistent relationship. This meant that bricks made in Mohenjo Daro would fit perfectly with bricks made in Harappa, hundreds of kilometers away. It meant that builders everywhere followed the same standards. It meant that the civilization possessed some form of central authority capable of enforcing these standards across vast distances. How did they achieve this? Was there a royal decree specifying brick dimensions? Was there a guild of brickmakers who trained apprentices in proper technique? Was there a religious law that declared improper bricks to be offensive to the gods? We do not know. The standardization is visible in the archaeological record. The mechanism behind it remains invisible. The homes of Mohenjo Daro were built primarily from baked brick. Sun-dried mud brick was used in many ancient civilizations. It was cheap and easy to produce, but it crumbled in heavy rain. It eroded over time. The Indus people invested enormous effort in firing their bricks. This required fuel. Vast quantities of wood had to be cut and transported. Kilns had to be built and maintained. The firing process had to be carefully controlled to produce strong, durable bricks. This was expensive. It was labor-intensive, but the result was cities that had partially survived for 4,000 years. Even today, visitors to Mohenjo Daro can walk down streets paved with the original bricks. They can see walls that have weathered countless monsoons. The investment in quality construction has paid dividends across millennia. Inside the homes, life unfolded in ways we can only partially reconstruct. Central courtyards provided light and ventilation. Rooms surrounding the courtyard served various purposes. Some were clearly kitchens with hearths for cooking. Others appear to have been storage areas where grain and other supplies were kept. Upper floors, where they existed, have mostly collapsed, but their presence is indicated by stairways that lead upward to empty air. Families may have slept on these upper levels, away from the noise and bustle of the streets. The wealthy apparently enjoyed more privacy. Their homes were oriented inward. Walls facing the street had few or no windows. This inward focus suggests a culture that valued domestic privacy. The home was a retreat from the public world. What happened inside remained hidden from neighbors and passers-by. We can imagine evening scenes in these courtyards. Families gathering after the day's work. Children playing games whose rules we will never know. Parents discussing matters of business or household management. Perhaps stories were told as darkness fell. Stories of gods and heroes, of creation and destruction. But what stories? What myths shaped the imagination of the Indus people? We have only fragments, images on seals that might depict deities, figurines that might represent goddesses or simply ordinary women. The narrative has been lost. Only the silent images remain. The craftsmen of the Indus Valley were extraordinarily skilled. They worked in stone, metal, clay, and precious materials. They created objects of stunning beauty and precision. Among the most famous artifacts are the seals. These small objects, usually made from steatite, were carved with intricate designs. They were typically square, measuring only a few centimeters on each side. On the front, images were carved in reverse, so they would appear correctly when pressed into soft clay. Most seals depict animals. The unicorn is the most common image, but this is not the magical horse of later legend. It is a bull-like creature shown in profile with what appears to be a single horn. In reality, it may have had two horns, but the artistic convention showed only one. Other seals show elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, and water buffalo. These animals would have been familiar inhabitants of the Indus region. But some seals show creatures that did not exist, composite beasts combining features of different animals. These fantastical beings suggest a rich mythological tradition, gods that took animal form, spirits that combined natural powers. We see the images but cannot hear the stories. Above or beside the animals, short inscriptions appear. These are the famous Indus script symbols. There are approximately 400 to 600 distinct signs. The exact number is uncertain because some signs might be variations of others. The inscriptions are always short. The longest known inscription contains only 26 symbols, most contain fewer than 10. This brevity is frustrating for scholars. With so little text to work with, decipherment becomes nearly impossible. We do not know what language the Indus people spoke. Some scholars believe it was an early form of Dravidian, the language family now spoken in southern India. Others argue for a connection to Sanskrit or other Indo-European languages. Still others suggest it was a language isolate, unrelated to any surviving tongue. The debate continues. Every few years, someone claims to have cracked the code. Every few years, other scholars point out flaws in the proposed decipherment. The Indus script remains undeciphered. It is one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history. If we could read these seals, entire worlds might open before us. We might learn the names of kings and priests. We might understand their religious beliefs. We might discover why their civilization collapsed. But the symbols keep their secrets. The seals were probably used for trade and administration. Merchants would press them into clay tags attached to goods. The impression would identify the owner or certify the contents. When the goods reached their destination, the seal impression would be checked. This system implies long-distance trade with trustworthy standards. Merchants in distant cities had to recognize and accept each other's seals. There had to be agreements about weights and measures. There had to be mechanisms for resolving disputes. All of this required sophisticated social organization. It required record-keeping, even if we cannot read the records. It required trust built up over generations. The Indus seals have been found far beyond the boundaries of the civilization itself. They appear in Mesopotamia, in sites like and Babylon. This proves that trade connected these distant regions. Indus merchants traveled to foreign lands, or foreign merchants visited the Indus and brought seals home as souvenirs or trade goods. What did the Indus people export? Probably textiles. They were among the earliest cultivators of cotton. Mesopotamian texts mention a distant land called Meluhha that exported exotic goods. Many scholars believe Meluhha was the Indus Valley. The text describes ships from Meluhha bringing precious stones, copper, and other luxury items. In return, the Indus people probably imported goods not available in their homeland. Perhaps tin, necessary for making bronze. Perhaps silver and gold. Perhaps simply the prestige of owning foreign objects. Trade connected the ancient world in ways we sometimes forget. Goods and ideas flowed across thousands of kilometers. People traveled and brought back knowledge of distant lands. A merchant from Mohenjo Daro might have walked the streets of He might have gazed upon the great ziggurat rising toward the heavens. He might have returned home with stories of strange gods and powerful kings. But whatever stories he told, they were not written down in any script we can read. Among the most haunting artifacts of the Indus Valley are the small figurines found throughout the cities. Many of these depict women. They are shown wearing elaborate headdresses and jewelry. Their features are stylized but expressive. Who were these women? Some scholars believe they represent a mother goddess. Fertility worship was common in many ancient cultures. A goddess associated with the earth, with crops, with childbirth. The abundance of female figurines might suggest that the Indus people worship such a deity, but others are more cautious. The figurines might simply be toys, children's dolls made to amuse and educate, or they might be decorative objects with no religious significance at all. Without written records explaining their purpose, we cannot know. Male figurines also exist, though they are less common. The most famous is the so-called priest king. This is a small limestone sculpture found in Mohenjo Daro. It depicts a bearded man with half-closed eyes. He wears a robe decorated with a trefoil pattern. A band encircles his head with a circular ornament at the center of his forehead. His expression is calm and introspective. He looks like a man engaged in meditation or prayer. Who was he? We call him a priest king, but this is our projection. He might have been a merchant, a craftsman, a storyteller. He might have been nobody important at all, just a model who sat for an anonymous artist 4,000 years ago. The trefoil pattern on his robe is intriguing. Similar patterns appear on seals and other objects. It may have been a religious symbol or a mark of status. In later Indian art, the trefoil appears in connection with certain deities. Could this be evidence of continuity, a symbol that persisted across millennia, or is the similarity coincidental? We cannot say with certainty. Another remarkable object is the dancing girl. This is a small bronze statue, barely 10 centimeters tall. It depicts a young woman in a confident pose. One hand rests on her hip. The other arm is covered with bangles from wrist to shoulder. She is naked except for a necklace. Her hair is styled in an elaborate arrangement. Her face wears an expression that seems almost modern in its self-assurance. She has been called the first portrait in Indian art. She captures an individual personality, not just a type. There is attitude in her stance. There is life in her eyes. Who was she? A dancer, perhaps, performing at festivals or religious ceremonies. A slave girl, owned by a wealthy household. A deity in human form. We will never know her name or her story, but across 4,000 years, she still seems ready to speak. The metalworking skills required to create this statue were considerable. The lost wax casting technique was used. First, the artist carved a model in wax, capturing every detail. Then the wax model was covered in clay. When the clay was heated, the wax melted and drained away. Molten bronze was poured into the empty mold. When the bronze cooled and hardened, the clay was broken away. The statue emerged, a permanent copy of the original wax model. This technique requires precision at every stage. The wax must be carved correctly. The clay must be applied evenly. The bronze must be heated to the right temperature. The cooling must be controlled to prevent cracks. The Indus craftsmen mastered all of this. They produced bronze objects of remarkable quality. Not just decorative items, but practical tools as well. Axes, knives, fishhooks, and other implements. These were the technologies of daily life. They helped farmers clear land and harvest crops. They helped fishermen bring in their catch. They helped craftsmen shape wood and leather and bone. Beyond bronze, the Indus people worked with gold, silver, copper, and lead. They created jewelry of extraordinary refinement. Beads made from carnelian, lapis lazuli, and other semi-precious stones. Some of these beads were drilled with holes so tiny they could only be threaded with the finest string. The drilling technology required patience and skill. Each bead might have taken hours or even days to complete. Gold was fashioned into delicate ornaments, necklaces, earrings, rings, and bracelets. These were the treasures of the wealthy. They proclaimed status and success. And they connected the Indus Valley to distant lands where precious metals and stones were mined. The workshops where these objects were made have been found in various parts of the cities. Specialized quarters housed different crafts. Here the potters worked their wheels. There the metal workers tended their furnaces. In another area, bead makers drilled and polished. This spatial organization suggests guilds or at least occupational communities. People practicing the same craft lived and worked near each other. They shared knowledge and techniques. They trained the next generation. This is how skills are preserved across time. Master to apprentice, parent to child, a chain of learning stretching back into the unrecorded past. The pottery of the Indus Valley is distinctive. It was made on wheels, a technology that speeds production enormously. The typical ware is red or buff-colored with black painted designs. Geometric patterns are common, intersecting circles, checkerboard squares, fish scale patterns, trees and leaves in stylized forms. Animal figures appear as well, fish, birds, and deer. These decorations were not random. Certain patterns appear consistently across the civilization. A potter in Harappa painted designs similar to those created by a potter in Mohenjo Daro. This suggests shared aesthetic traditions. Perhaps potters traveled between cities, spreading styles. Perhaps there were common cultural practices that shaped artistic expression. The pottery was functional as well as decorative. Storage jars held grain and other supplies. Cooking vessels were used over open fires. Drinking cups and eating bowls served daily meals. Water containers allowed people to carry liquid from wells to homes. Some pottery had special purposes. Large jars with pointed bottoms were designed to stand in holes in the ground. They kept their contents cool in the hot climate. Small pots with narrow necks may have held oils or medicines. Miniature vessels might have been toys or offerings to gods. The diversity of pottery type shows a complex society with many needs. People did not simply eat and drink. They stored, preserved, transported, and displayed. Each activity required its own specialized container. The potters of the Indus met these needs with creativity and skill. Beyond crafts, the economy of the Indus Valley rested on agriculture. The vast majority of people were farmers. They worked the fields that surrounded the cities. They grew the food that fed the craftsmen and merchants. Without their labor, civilization could not exist. Wheat and barley were the primary grain crops. These were grown during the winter months, when cooler temperatures favored their growth. After harvest, the grain was stored in large facilities. The granary at Mohenjo Daro may have served this purpose. Centralized storage allowed surplus grain to be redistributed. It could feed people during shortages. It could be traded to obtain other goods. It could support specialists who did not grow their own food. Cotton cultivation was perhaps the most innovative agricultural achievement. The Indus people were among the first in the world to domesticate cotton. They spun it into thread. They wove it into cloth. They may have dyed it with colors extracted from plants. Cotton textiles became a valuable export. Mesopotamian texts mention cotton as a product of distant lands. The technology for processing cotton is complex. The fibers must be separated from the seeds. They must be cleaned and aligned. They must be spun into threads strong enough for weaving. The Indus people developed all of this independently. They created an industry that would eventually transform the global economy. Thousands of years later, cotton would fuel the Industrial Revolution. It would drive colonial expansion. It would shape the modern world. All of this began in the Indus Valley. Cattle were central to the agricultural system. They pulled plows through heavy soil. They hauled carts loaded with goods. They provided milk and meat. Their dung was used as fuel and fertilizer. The importance of cattle is reflected in the art. Seals frequently depict bulls. Some of these bulls are shown with enormous humps and powerful bodies. They seem almost worshipful in their presentation. Was the bull sacred to the Indus people? In later Hinduism, the bull Nandi is the vehicle of the god Shiva. Cattle are considered sacred and protected. Could these beliefs trace back to the Indus era? The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. We see bulls on seals. We see that cattle were important to the economy, but we cannot hear the prayers that may have been offered. We cannot read the hymns that may have been sung. Water buffalo were also domesticated. These powerful animals are well suited to wet conditions. They could work in flooded rice paddies. They could wallow in rivers and ponds to stay cool. But the Indus Valley was not primarily a rice-growing region. Rice appears in the archaeological record, but it was a minor crop. The water buffalo served other purposes. Milk, meat, labor. The same basic functions as cattle. Sheep and goats provided wool and meat. Pigs were raised in some communities. Dogs lived alongside humans, perhaps as pets, perhaps as working animals. Elephants appear on seals, suggesting they were known and perhaps sometimes domesticated. The full range of animals reflects a diverse economy. Different creatures serve different needs. Different communities may have specialized in different livestock. Trade would have distributed animal products throughout the region. The rivers were rich with fish. Fishing was an important supplement to farming. Hooks, nets, and other fishing equipment have been found. Fish appear in the art, suggesting their cultural significance. Perhaps fish were offerings to gods. Perhaps certain species had symbolic meanings. Or perhaps people simply enjoyed eating them. Hunting continued even in settled agricultural communities. Wild deer, antelope, and boar roamed the surrounding lands. Hunters pursued them for meat and sport. Birds were caught for food and perhaps for their feathers. The rivers and wetlands attracted waterfowl. These could be trapped or shot with arrows. The diet of the Indus people was varied and nutritious. Grains provided carbohydrates. Meat and fish provided protein. Milk and dairy products added fat and calcium. Fruits, vegetables, and legumes supplied vitamins and minerals. This healthy diet supported a large population. People lived long enough to master complex crafts. They had energy to build cities and maintain infrastructure. Good nutrition was the invisible foundation of civilization. The cities depended on the countryside, and the countryside depended on the rivers. When the rivers flowed predictably, life was good. When they flooded too much or too little, disaster struck. The Indus people were always at the mercy of water. They worked to control it with their channels and drains. But ultimately, they could not command the rains. They could not prevent the rivers from changing course, and when the environment began to shift, their world began to crumble. But that catastrophe lay in the future. For centuries, the system worked. The cities prospered. The trade routes hummed with activity. The craftsmen created their wonders, and generation after generation lived out their lives in the shadow of the citadel. What did they believe awaited them after death? Burial practices offer some clues. The Indus people generally buried their dead in simple graves. Bodies were usually laid on their backs with heads pointing north. Some graves contained pottery and personal ornaments. These grave goods suggest belief in an afterlife. The dead would need vessels for food and drink. They would need jewelry to adorn themselves. But the graves are modest compared to those of Egypt or Mesopotamia. There are no elaborate tombs filled with treasures. There are no mummified bodies preserved for eternity. Perhaps the Indus people believed the afterlife was simple. Perhaps material goods were less important than spiritual preparation. Perhaps cremation was also practiced, leaving no trace in the archaeological record. Some evidence suggests that burial customs changed over time. Earlier graves tend to be more elaborate. Later graves are simpler and contain fewer goods. This might indicate economic decline, or it might reflect changing religious beliefs. Death and what follows remain as mysterious as everything else in this civilization. The ordinary graves contrast sharply with the impressive public buildings. The Indus people seem to have invested more in living infrastructure than in monuments to the dead. This is almost the opposite of ancient Egypt. The pharaohs spent enormous resources on their tombs. They built pyramids that still astonish visitors today. But they built relatively little for ordinary citizens. The Indus rulers, if rulers they were, made different choices. They built drains and baths and granaries. They created systems that served the living, and they took modest graves to the afterlife. What values does this reflect? Perhaps a belief that community mattered more than individual glory. Perhaps a faith that positioned the soul's fate beyond material goods. Perhaps simply a different concept of power and prestige. Without written records, we can only speculate. But the evidence consistently points toward a society less focused on hierarchy than its contemporaries. This does not mean the Indus Valley was egalitarian. Some houses were clearly larger and finer than others. Some people owned more jewelry and better goods. Economic inequality existed, but the extremes seem less pronounced. There are no palaces that dwarf ordinary homes by orders of magnitude. There are no tombs filled with enough gold to finance a modern war. The range from rich to poor was narrower, or perhaps the wealthy simply displayed their status differently, through the quality of their crafts, through their positions in social networks, through knowledge and skills that leave no archaeological trace. The religion of the Indus people remains largely unknown. We have already mentioned the possible mother goddess figurines. We have noted the prominence of animals, especially bulls on seals. But there are other tantalizing hints. One of the most discussed seal images shows a figure seated in what appears to be a yoga posture. The figure sits cross-legged with hands resting on knees. It wears an elaborate horned headdress. Animals surround it on all sides. A tiger stands to one side. An elephant and rhinoceros appear on the other. Below the seated figure, two deer face each other. This image has been called the Proto-Shiva seal. Some scholars believe it represents an early form of the Hindu god Shiva. Shiva is associated with yoga and meditation. He is called Pashupati, lord of animals. He is often depicted surrounded by creatures. The similarities are striking, but other scholars urge caution. The image might represent a completely different deity. It might not be religious at all. 4,000 years separate this seal from classical Hinduism. Much can change in that time. We should not assume continuity without solid evidence, and yet the possibility remains tantalizing. If this truly is an early form of Shiva, it would connect the Indus Valley directly to modern religious practice. Billions of Hindus today would be worshipping a god whose origins stretch back to Mohenjo Daro. The sacred thread of tradition would span 40 centuries. What a thought to drift off to sleep with. Trees appear on many seals and may have held religious significance. The pipal tree, in particular, is depicted with special reverence. In later Hinduism and Buddhism, sacred trees are important. The Buddha achieved enlightenment under a pipal tree. Hindu rituals often involve offerings to trees. Again, we see possible continuity, or possibly coincidence. Water worship is strongly suggested by the Great Bath and the elaborate drainage systems. Ritual purification through bathing is central to later Indian religion. The Ganges is holy. Morning ablutions are performed by millions. Temple tanks allow worshippers to cleanse themselves before approaching the divine. Could these practices originate in the Indus Valley? The architectural evidence points toward yes. The Great Bath was not merely a swimming pool. Its location in the Citadel suggests public importance. Its careful waterproofing suggests special significance. People came here for a purpose beyond simple hygiene. They came to purify their bodies and perhaps their souls. But what prayers did they say? What rituals did they perform? What did the water mean to them? The answers have washed away with time. Fire also played a role in Indus religious practice. Several sites contain what appear to be fire altars. These are brick platforms with signs of repeated burning. Fire worship is central to later Vedic religion. The sacred fire Agni receives offerings in Hindu rituals. Zoroastrianism in neighboring Iran also centers on fire worship. The presence of fire altars in the Indus Valley suggests possible connections. But once again, we must be cautious. Many cultures use fire in religious contexts. The presence of altars does not prove specific beliefs. It only shows that controlled burning had special significance. The fire may have been offered to gods. It may have been used for purification. It may have been part of funerary rites. Without texts, we simply cannot know. Some scholars have attempted to connect Indus religion to the Vedas. The Vedas are the oldest Hindu scriptures. They were composed in Sanskrit by the Indo-Aryan peoples. They describe a religion centered on sacrificial fire and powerful deities like Indra and Agni. Some have argued that the Vedas describe the Indus Valley Civilization, that the Indo-Aryans encountered the Indus people and incorporated elements of their religion, that Shiva and other later gods evolved from Indus predecessors. Others vehemently disagree. They see the Vedic religion as fundamentally different. They point to the lack of temples and idols in the Indus cities. They note that Vedic religion seems more pastoral than urban. The debate is heated and often political. In modern India, the question of who built the Indus cities carries nationalist implications. Were the builders ancestors of current Indians? Were they a separate people displaced by later arrivals? These questions touch on identity and pride. They cannot be answered by archaeology alone. For now, we must accept uncertainty. The religion of the Indus people was their own. It may have influenced later traditions. It may have vanished completely. We see only the outermost edges of what they believed. The center remains in darkness. The decline and fall of the Indus Valley Civilization is as mysterious as its religion. At some point after 1900 BCE, the great cities began to decline. Mohenjo Daro shows signs of deterioration. Buildings were less well maintained, drains became clogged, streets accumulated debris, the population seems to have decreased. By 1700 BCE or so, the city was largely abandoned. Harappa followed a similar trajectory. Smaller settlements persisted longer, but they too eventually faded. By 1300 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization as a distinct entity had ceased to exist. What happened? Many theories have been proposed. The oldest theory blamed invasion, specifically the invasion of the Indo-Aryan peoples. These nomadic tribes entered South Asia from the northwest. They spoke an early form of Sanskrit. They eventually came to dominate the subcontinent. The invasion theory suggested that they violently conquered the Indus cities, that they destroyed the civilization and slaughtered its people. Some even pointed to groups of skeletons found in Mohenjo Daro as evidence of massacre, but this theory has largely been abandoned. The skeletons have been re-examined and do not show clear signs of violence. They date to different periods and may represent ordinary deaths. There is no evidence of warfare on a scale that could destroy entire cities, no burned buildings, no defensive fortifications hastily constructed, no weapons scattered in the streets. If the Indo-Aryans did encounter the Indus people, the interaction was probably gradual. Migration, not invasion. Absorption, not annihilation. Climate change has emerged as a more compelling explanation. We know that the environment of the Indus region has shifted dramatically over time. The monsoon rains that nourished the civilization may have weakened. The rivers that provided water may have changed their courses. The Gagahakra river system is central to this theory. This network of rivers once flowed through the heart of the Indus region. Hundreds of settlements clustered along its banks, but geological evidence shows that these rivers dried up. Their sources in the Himalayas shifted. Tectonic activity may have disrupted their flow. As the rivers shrank, the settlements they supported became unsustainable. Farmers who had relied on annual floods found their fields parched. Wells had to be dug deeper and deeper. Eventually, the water simply was not there. People had to move. They migrated east toward the Ganges river system. They migrated south into Gujarat and beyond. They took their skills and knowledge with them, but they could not take their cities. Mohenjo Daro and Harappa were bound to their locations. When the environment no longer supported dense urban populations, the cities died, not in flames, but in slow abandonment. This theory fits the archaeological evidence better than invasion. The decline was gradual. Standards slipped over generations. People left in search of better opportunities elsewhere. The magnificent infrastructure fell into disrepair because there was no one left to maintain it. Other factors may have contributed. Disease could have swept through crowded populations. Trade networks could have collapsed, cutting off vital supplies. Social or political instability could have undermined central authority. Perhaps the very success of the civilization contained the seeds of its destruction. The population may have grown beyond what the environment could sustain. Forests may have been stripped for fuel to fire endless bricks. Soil may have become exhausted from continuous cultivation. The rivers may have silted up from erosion caused by deforestation. We see similar patterns in other civilizations. The Maya cities were abandoned as their environment degraded. Easter Island's population collapsed after they cut down all their trees. Sustainability is a modern concern with ancient precedents. The Indus Valley may have been one of the earliest victims of environmental overreach. But we should be careful not to impose modern concepts too readily. The Indus people faced challenges we can barely imagine. They had no scientific understanding of climate or ecology. They could not predict how the rivers would shift. They did their best with the knowledge they had. For 1,000 years, they succeeded brilliantly. And then their luck ran out. The end was not absolute. The people did not disappear. They moved, they adapted, they merged with other populations. Their genetic and cultural legacy persists today. Studies of modern South Asian DNA show continuity with ancient populations. The descendants of the Indus people still live in the subcontinent. They may number in the hundreds of millions, but their specific cultural identity was lost. Their language fell silent. Their script became unreadable. Their religion transformed into something new. Fragments remain, embedded in later traditions, perhaps in the sacred baths of Hindu temples, perhaps in the reverence for cattle, perhaps in the yoga postures that appear on ancient seals, but the continuous chain of memory was broken. No stories passed from generation to generation. No books preserved ancient wisdom. The Indus people became unknown even to their own descendants. This is perhaps the deepest mystery of all. How does a civilization simply forget itself? How do millions of people lose track of who they were? The answer lies in the nature of cultural transmission. Without writing that can be read, knowledge becomes fragile. It depends on living teachers who remember. But teachers grow old and die. If their students have already moved away, the knowledge dies with them. A few generations of disruption can break chains that stretch back centuries. The Indus people may have had rich oral traditions. Epic poems like the Mahabharata were preserved orally for centuries before being written down. But oral traditions require communities to sustain them. When communities scatter, when languages change, the stories are lost. Imagine the last speaker of the Indus language, an old person living among people who speak different tongues. Their children have learned the new languages of new neighbors. Their grandchildren understand nothing of the old ways. When this last speaker dies, silence falls forever. It is a melancholy image. But it has happened countless times throughout human history. Languages die, cultures vanish, the past recedes beyond recovery. The Indus Valley Civilization slept beneath the soil for nearly 4,000 years. Occasionally, farmers would unearth ancient bricks or curious artifacts, but no one understood what they meant. The historical memory of India jumped from the Vedas to the present. The great cities were forgotten. The rediscovery began in the 1820s during British colonial rule. Charles Masson, a deserter from the British East India Company's army, wandered through the Punjab region. He came across an ancient mound near the village of Harappa. Local people told him it was very old. They said a powerful king had once ruled there. Masson recorded the site, but did not excavate it. Others followed. Alexander Cunningham, later the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, visited Harappa in 1853 and again in 1873. He recognized that the site was ancient, but he did not grasp just how ancient. He assumed the ruins were Buddhist, perhaps 1,000 years old. It was not until the 1920s that the full picture began to emerge. Sir John Marshall, then Director General of the Archaeological Survey, supervised excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo Daro. His teams uncovered street after street of ancient buildings. They found the Great Bath and the so-called granary. They collected thousands of seals with their enigmatic script. Marshall made a dramatic announcement. He declared that a previously unknown civilization had been discovered, a civilization contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, a civilization with achievements to match either. The news caused a sensation. The ancient history of South Asia had to be rewritten. No longer was the subcontinent a latecomer to civilization. It was one of the original hearths of human urban life. The excavations continued through the 1920s and 1930s. More sites were discovered. The full extent of the civilization gradually became clear. It was not just 2 cities, it was hundreds of settlements scattered across a vast territory. It was a unified culture sharing common standards. It was something unprecedented in the ancient world. World War II interrupted archaeological work. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 created new complications. Mohenjo Daro ended up in Pakistan. Harappa also fell within Pakistani borders. Many other sites are in India. The single civilization was now divided between 2 nations. This has complicated research ever since. Pakistani and Indian archaeologists sometimes have difficulty collaborating. Political tensions affect scholarly exchange. The Indus Valley Civilization belongs to both countries and neither. It predates the modern division by thousands of years. It reminds us that borders are temporary. Cultures flow across lines on maps. Despite these challenges, research has continued. New technologies have revolutionized our understanding. Satellite imagery has revealed ancient river courses. Ground-penetrating radar has detected buried structures. DNA analysis has traced population movements. Climate reconstructions have shown environmental changes. Each new discovery adds detail to the picture, but each new discovery also raises new questions. The basic mysteries remain unsolved. Who ruled the Indus cities? What religion did they follow? What language did they speak? Why did their civilization decline? Perhaps future discoveries will provide answers. Perhaps a bilingual inscription will be found, allowing the script to be deciphered at last. Perhaps new archaeological techniques will reveal structures we have missed. Perhaps genetic analysis will clarify population origins and migrations. Or perhaps the mysteries will remain forever. Perhaps the Indus people will always hover at the edge of our understanding, known enough to intrigue, unknown enough to haunt. That uncertainty is part of their appeal. In a world where we think we know everything, they remind us of how much has been lost. They remind us that civilizations can rise and fall without leaving a clear record. They remind us that our own achievements may someday be equally mysterious to future generations. What would archaeologists of the year 6000 make of our cities? Could they reconstruct our beliefs from the buildings we leave behind? Could they decipher our languages if all our digital records were lost? Could they understand what we valued and feared and hoped for? Perhaps they would face mysteries as deep as those of Mohenjo Daro. The Indus Valley Civilization was not alone in its era. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus formed a trio of early urban societies. They knew of each other. They traded with each other. They may have influenced each other in ways we do not fully understand, but the Indus was always the most enigmatic. Egypt left pyramids and mummies and walls covered with hieroglyphics. Mesopotamia left clay tablets by the 100,000. The Indus left bricks and seals and questions. This comparative silence should not diminish our appreciation. The achievements of the Indus people were remarkable by any standard. They built cities that worked. They created infrastructure that served their populations. They developed crafts of extraordinary beauty and skill. They traded across vast distances. They maintained order and cooperation across their territory. For 1,000 years, they sustained one of the most successful civilizations on Earth. That success was real, even if we cannot fully understand how it was achieved. The methods remain hidden, but the results are visible in every brick, every drain, every carefully carved seal. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself once more in Mohenjo Daro. The sun has set. The streets are quieting. Families are settling in for the evening. In the great bath, the last bathers are emerging, water dripping from their bodies. They feel purified, renewed, ready for whatever tomorrow brings. A merchant is checking his seals, running his thumb over the carved unicorn. He is planning a journey to distant lands. A potter is banking the fire in her kiln. Tomorrow she will open it and see if her latest batch has turned out well. A child is falling asleep on a rooftop, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Dogs bark, cattle low in their pens. Somewhere, someone is playing a simple melody on a reed flute. The music drifts through the warm night air. It is a scene of peace and plenty, a scene that played out thousands of times over hundreds of years. These were real people living real lives. They loved and grieved and laughed and worried. They were not fundamentally different from us. They were human. And now they are gone. Their names are forgotten. Their stories are lost. Only their works remain. Bricks that have outlasted empires. Drains that still carry water after 40 centuries. Seals that still sparkle when they catch the light. The silence of the Indus people is not emptiness. It is presence. It is the weight of everything we cannot know pressing against us. It is the faces of millions looking back from the darkness. They cannot speak, but they are there. Visiting Mohenjo Daro today is a strange experience. The ruins rise from the flat plain of Sindh province in Pakistan. The landscape is harsh and dry. It is hard to imagine this as fertile farmland, but the rivers have shifted. The climate has changed. What was once green is now brown. The archaeological site covers a small portion of the original city. Much remains unexcavated. Some areas are inaccessible. Others have been damaged by weather and neglect. Conservation is a constant challenge. The bricks that have survived for millennia are now threatened by salt crystallization. Groundwater rises through the structures, carrying dissolved salts. When the water evaporates, the salts are left behind. They grow into crystals that crack and crumble the ancient bricks. UNESCO has listed Mohenjo Daro as a World Heritage Site. International efforts have attempted to halt the decay, but the problems continue. Climate change brings more extreme weather. Floods threaten to inundate the site. Heat waves accelerate the salt damage. The very forces that ended the civilization may eventually destroy what remains. There is a terrible irony in this. The Indus people were masters of water management. They built their cities to resist floods. They channeled water where they wanted it to go. Now that mastery has failed, the water does what it will, and slowly, patiently, it erodes the legacy of those ancient engineers. Visitors who walk the streets of Mohenjo Daro report a sense of presence, not ghosts exactly, but an awareness of those who walked here before. The streets are narrow and shadowed. The buildings loom on either side. It is easy to imagine the bustle of ancient life, the shouts of vendors, the rumble of cartwheels, the chatter of neighbors gossiping, all of it silent now, all of it waiting to be heard. The Indus Valley Civilization continues to inspire artists and writers. Something about its mystery calls to the imagination. We can project onto it whatever we wish. A utopia of peaceful cooperation, a dystopia of hidden tyranny, a society of mystics exploring inner realms, a society of pragmatic merchants counting profits. The silence allows all interpretations. Perhaps that is why the Indus endures in our imagination. It is a mirror that shows us ourselves. We see what we hope for fear. We see what we imagine is possible for human societies. The questions raised by Mohenjo Daro and Harappa are ultimately questions about us. What makes a civilization successful? What causes civilizations to fail? Can we live together in dense populations without destroying each other? Can we manage our environment sustainably? Can we build something that lasts? The Indus people achieved all of this for a time. They showed it was possible, and then they showed it was not permanent. Nothing is permanent. That is perhaps the final lesson of the Indus Valley. Every achievement is temporary. Every city will someday be ruins. Every civilization will eventually fall silent. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a recognition of reality. We build knowing that our buildings will crumble. We create knowing that our creations will be forgotten. We live knowing that we will die, and yet we continue. The Indus people continued for 1,000 years. They raised children and built homes and made beautiful things. They did not need guarantees of permanence. They found meaning in the present moment. Perhaps that is what the Great Bath taught. Step into the water. Feel the cool embrace. Let the impurities wash away. For this moment, you are clean. For this moment, you are alive. That is enough. That has always been enough. As you lie in the darkness, let the images of Mohenjo Daro fade. Let the ancient streets dissolve into mist. Let the seals and figurines return to the earth from which they were dug. What remains is quietness. What remains is the rhythm of your own breath. What remains is the present moment, which is all anyone ever has. The Indus people lived 4,000 years ago. They are gone. But tonight, you remembered them. Tonight, you carried them forward into the present. Tonight, they lived again in your imagination. That is a kind of immortality, not permanent, but real. As long as someone remembers, the past is not entirely lost. As long as someone asks questions, the silence is not complete. The mysteries of the Indus Valley will remain mysteries. We will probably never know who ruled those cities. We will probably never read those seals. We will probably never understand their religion or their daily thoughts. But we can honor them by continuing to wonder. We can honor them by admitting what we do not know. We can honor them by approaching the past with humility rather than arrogance. They were here. They mattered. They deserved to be remembered. And now, finally, let yourself drift. The waters of the Great Bath are calm and still. The bricks of Mohenjo Daro hold the heat of a sun that set long ago. The seals lie waiting to be discovered again and again. The The flute music has faded to nothing. The stars are the same stars that shone over the Indus 4,000 years ago. The same moon rises. The same darkness falls. You are connected to those ancient people by the thread of shared humanity. You breathe the same air they breathe. You feel the same needs they felt. You wonder the same wonders. In the end, that is what history gives us. Not answers, but connections. Not certainty, but companionship. We are not alone in time. We are part of a stream that stretches back to the beginning. And somewhere in that stream, the people of Mohenjo Daro are still bathing, still trading, still carving their mysterious seals. They do not know that their world will end. They do not know that their language will be forgotten. They are simply living day by day, moment by moment. Just as we are. Just as we always have been. Just as we always will be, until our own moment ends. Sleep now. Dream of ancient waters. Dream of perfect bricks. Dream of secrets that will never be told. And know that somewhere, somewhen, someone is dreaming of you. The night deepens around you. Your breathing slows. Your thoughts become soft and wandering. You are no longer quite here. You are drifting in the space between waking and sleeping. In that space, time does not work as it usually does. The past and present blend together. You can almost hear the voices of Mohenjo Daro, not words you understand, just the murmur of human conversation, the sound of people being people, working, resting, loving, grieving, all the ordinary activities that make up a life, all the ordinary activities that make up a civilization. The Indus Valley people did not think of themselves as ancient. They were modern, cutting edge, the pinnacle of their time. Their cities were marvels of engineering. Their crafts were the finest in the world. Their trade network spanned continents. They had no reason to think it would ever end. But it did end, not with a bang, as the poet said, but with a whimper. The rivers shifted, the rains failed, the people drifted away, the cities slowly crumbled back into the earth. And now, 4,000 years later, we dig them up again. We try to understand, we fail, we try again. This is the work of history. It never ends. There is always more to discover, more to interpret, more to wonder about. The Indus Valley Civilization is one chapter in a book that has no final page. Every generation adds to the story. Every new discovery changes what we thought we knew. Perhaps someday the script will be deciphered. Perhaps someday we will read the thoughts of those ancient people in their own words. What would they say? Would they be pleased that we remember them? Would they be surprised that we care? Would they recognize themselves in our descriptions? Or would they shake their heads at how much we've gotten wrong? We will probably never know, but we can keep trying. We can keep asking. We can keep the mystery alive. The night is fully dark now. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The same stars that guided Indus merchants on their journeys. The same stars that shone on the Great Bath. The same stars that will shine long after our own civilization has crumbled. You are very close to sleep now. Let the last images fade. Let the thoughts disperse like morning mist. There is only darkness now. There is only peace. There is only the eternal present moment, which contains all of history within it. Mohenjo Daro sleeps. Harappa sleeps. The Indus Valley sleeps beneath the soil of Pakistan and India, and you sleep with them, connected across time and space. Part of the great human family that stretches back to the beginning. Tomorrow you will wake. Tomorrow you will return to your modern life with its modern concerns. But tonight you have traveled. Tonight you have traveled. Tonight you have touched the past. Tonight you have remembered people who would otherwise be forgotten. That is a gift you have given them. And they have given you a gift in return. The gift of perspective. The gift of wonder, the gift of knowing that there is always more to learn. Sleep well, my dear friends, sleep deep. Dream of ancient waters and perfect bricks. Dream of seals with unicorns and tigers. Dream of languages we cannot speak. and wake renewed, carrying the Indus Valley forward into another day. The silence of the past is not emptiness. It is invitation. It is mystery waiting to be entered. It is the darkness before dawn. Good night.